So what does the Royal Proclamation line mean for Americans? Well, frankly, for most Americans, it doesn't have any difference. It does not make any difference to them. I mean, to be honest, there was still plenty of land east of the Proclamation line that Americans could settle. I mean, it's not like people need to get out there to settle there because there's no land in the east. There's still a lot of land in the east. And there's a practical reason why the colonies had stuck to the Atlantic coast, why the settlers had mostly been there. And I wish I could lead you through this with class discussion, because I always try to let students sort of develop this thinking themselves. But what do most Americans want to do with land? Well, what they want to do is grow crops that they can export. I mean, this is what America is. We're a nation of small farmers. Not a nation, we're a group of small farmers, yeoman farmers, middle-class farmers, who grow stuff for export, and that's what our economy depends on. We export raw materials to England and other parts of the world, and then we get stuff from them. We get all of the manufactured goods and other things that England produces, that Europe produces, that give us our modern way of life. But you've got to get your product to market. You've got to get it down to the coast where you can put it on a boat, and then the boat is going to carry it to England, mainly to England, but secondarily to the West Indies, also, as I've told you, to Europe, other places of Europe, France, Spain, the Mediterranean. We have markets in a lot of Western Europe. But you've got to get it to the port. And the way you do that is that there are navigable rivers that run into the Atlantic that are accessible, in some cases, 50 or more miles into the interior. The east coast of North America is really very congenial for settlement because there are so many rivers. And you can sail up those rivers. You can have a sailboat go up the Hudson River, the Delaware River, the Charles River. There's lots of rivers into the interior. And so people can go up into the interior, settle along those rivers, take their product down to the river through some tributaries or whatever, float it down to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, wherever. And there are harbors there. There are a lot of good harbors on the East Coast. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia are the biggest ones, but there's smaller ones all along the coast there. In Virginia, there aren't many cities at the ports. But people can have trading all along the river. There's a lot of plantation owners who are right on the river, have a little dock there that people can bring their products to and put it on a boat. But you're dependent on getting into the interior, or getting from the interior down to the coast, and those rivers only run a certain distance. I think 50 miles is a pretty long distance. I mean, some of those rivers are amazing. You can, let's say, sail a sailboat 50 miles into the interior, but no further. That's why all of the English settlement is along the Atlantic coast. It's all within traveling distance, it's all within hauling distance of a port. If you go west of that, there's no way you can do that. You can't get stuff over the Appalachian Mountains. You can't get a year's harvest. You can carry small products. There's ways that pack trains can go through there, and they can carry limited amounts of stuff. But to really have a harvest, to really depend on doing what you do, where you produce stuff for export, to do it west of the Appalachians, no. The Appalachians are a barrier. So the Proclamation line just sort of reinforces what's a natural barrier. Yeah, you draw a line, but you don't need to, because the Appalachians themselves are a barrier. They're keeping Americans east of the Appalachians. But if you think about this, and you look at a map, you can say, well, you know what? There's another alternative here. There is a way to get around that barrier of the Appalachian Mountains. And if you look at a map in your textbook, and maybe you can figure out what that alternative is. West of the Appalachians, there's a lot of rivers there throughout the whole western area. Many of them are tributaries of the Ohio River. And so you could float your product on a barge or whatever, your year's harvest, big product. You could put it on a barge, float it down some tributary, down the Ohio River, then you go down the river, and if you look at a map, you go to the Mississippi River, and then you just keep going, and you go down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a city called New Orleans. And what you can think about, now you don't really need this right now. As I say, there's plenty of land east of the mountains. But in the long run, you could start settling in the west and using the river network of the whole Ohio Valley, the whole Missouri Valley on the other side of the Mississippi. There's the Missouri River, does the same thing. That's way off in the distance, so that's some years away, but eventually you can use that whole network of rivers to carry your stuff, and it mostly goes down to New Orleans. It all focuses on New Orleans. So New Orleans becomes a real important center. Well, as of 1763, New Orleans, which had been established by the French, becomes a Spanish port. As part of the deal to end the war, part of the complex terms of the Treaty of Paris, the Spanish acquired all of the French Empire west of the Mississippi. In return, England got Florida, which had been Spanish. So it's a complex trade-off there in the treaty. New Orleans, although it's east of the Mississippi, it's on the east bank, nevertheless became part of the Spanish Empire. And Spain shows no signs of allowing English people to use the port for exporting. So, as of 1763, the idea that you could settle west of the mountains is still not available. It depends on New Orleans, and for now, New Orleans is out of the thinking. But some people can look ahead and say, well, maybe it's not an option right now, but sometime in the future, we may solve what I call the New Orleans problem. Maybe, one way or the other, we don't know how. I mean, this is all way into the future, and this is all speculative at this point. For now, we're just going to be settling east of the Appalachians, and we're not worrying about the area in the west, but maybe sometime in the future, if we can somehow get access to New Orleans, maybe we'll convince Spain to let us use it, or maybe we'll take it away from Spain and turn it into an English or something, we don't know. But if somehow we get access to New Orleans, then we can start settling that land west of the Appalachians, what I call the West, just to simplify. And there are people, most people don't even think about it. This is way in the future, it's all tentative and it's all speculative and it's not here right now. But there are people who are thinking about this, and they're saying to themselves, if somehow I can become the owner of some of that land out there in the West, out in the Ohio Valley, through Ohio, what is now Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, that area. If I can get some of that land, then I can start selling it to settlers. If I can get a big chunk of that land, I can start selling it to settlers who are eventually going to come out and start wanting to settle there and to send their goods down to New Orleans. And so some of those guys who were kind of looking ahead to the future and thinking that, if I can get on the ground floor and get a big block of that land, when the time comes, when we settle the New Orleans problem, then I'm going to get really rich. Especially in Virginia, people are thinking about that. And Virginia is the key colony because Virginia says, by our treaty, by our charter from 1606, which been 150 years ago, but by that charter, that land west of the Mississippi is going to be ours. And the Assembly of Virginia, we're still calling itself the House of Burgesses, they can start giving that land to friends, political allies, relatives, buddies, whatever, and then they can own that land and they can make a fortune. So in fact, the Virginia Assembly, even before this was really British territory, even before the treaty had been signed, even before we actually had the land, people are looking ahead and saying, hey, we're going to get that land from France, and it'll be in the hands of the Virginia Assembly, and the Virginia Assembly is going to give me or some of my buddies, there's some land companies that are going to take some of this land, and we're all going to get rich. And there are some familiar names who are involved in that. Two are from Virginia, George Washington, some of you have heard of him, Thomas Jefferson. They both are involved in some of these land companies. And then another name is Ben Franklin. He's actually from Pennsylvania, but he was involved. He had friends in Virginia, and so he's also an investor in some of these companies that have got this land and that are going to make a lot of money from it. And then here comes the Royal Proclamation line. And it says, no, you can't do it. The land grants that the Virginia Assembly had made were all canceled. You can't do that. It's not available to you. It's not under the control of the Assembly. It's under the control of the Indians. This is Indian country. We're going to let the Indians live out there. We're going to leave them, let them keep that land so they don't fight against us, and then we'd have to send a lot of soldiers and spend a lot of money to shoot them up and kill them and drive them off that land. So there are people in America who resent the proclamation line. It doesn't affect many Americans, but there are some key people who have big plans that proclamation line cancels. But as sort of the next step after the proclamation line, England decides we've got to keep the soldiers out there. I mean, we don't know what's going on. We're going to try to protect them. We're going to try to tell them we're going to keep white people out of your hair so they won't fight us. But we still need to have some troops out there. And always, British policy had said that defense of the colonies is a responsibility of each colony. Each colony has an assembly. Each assembly has the power to tax. Each assembly established a militia. They're responsible for defense. But that's not going to work. You can't do that. First of all, we know from our experience during the war that the assemblies and the militias are not entirely reliable. And they're there to defend their colony. They're not there to send troops from the militia on long-term assignments to the, God knows, the far west, Pittsburgh or someplace. So we can't count on the militias. That's the way we've always done this, but that was when the empire was little all along the coast. Now it's this huge area that extends all the way up to the Mississippi. We can't rely on it. We gotta have redcoats out there. And then that raises the inevitable question, who's gonna pay for it? Always, of course, the redcoats, they were paid for by the English government. The Parliament imposed taxes, the money went to the Royal Treasury, and they were part of the British, part of England, part of the English component of the British Empire. And that's the way it worked. But you know, the leaders of Parliament start looking at this and they say, geez, that's going to cost a lot of money. And meanwhile, we've got all the other expenses of the empire. I mean, just normal stuff that we got to spend money on. And then complicating our financial situation, we've got this huge debt. We've got to repay all the money that we borrowed during the war. So, I mean, and meanwhile, English taxpayers are saying, hey, you imposed heavy taxes on us during the war is over, you've got to reduce these taxes. You've got to lower taxes down to levels that we can afford to pay. So the leaders of Parliament are just stuck between where is all this money going to come from and how are they going to get all the money to pay for all the expenses, including, in addition to everything else, something that they never had to pay. They never had to pay to keep troops in North America. And that was why they loved salutary neglect. That's why they gave salutary neglect, so that they don't have to spend any money on an army in America. So, by this time, unfortunately, William Pitt has sort of retired from service. And it's a little bit complicated as to what's going on there in England. The problem is that William Pitt, although he was a very effective leader during the war and he was a brilliant guy, and he understood and appreciated the importance of North America, he had problems. He had health problems. He had physical health problems, and sad to say, he had mental health problems. His family had some serious mental health issues. He had a sister who spent her whole life in an asylum, luxury asylum, because her family was wealthy and they took good care of her. But she had mental health issues, and some of that affected William. So William just sort of dropped out of sight because of his health. And the new leaders of Parliament were some of them were real hack politicians, and looking at English politics from the English standpoint now it's a mess. And we're not getting into it because it gets too far off of our subject. We just to say that the new leaders of Parliament, some of whom were capable, most of whom were not, but they've got to make some tough decisions about how are they going to pay to keep this army in America. Well, you can probably guess where this is going to go. Some of you know a little bit about this. Parliament decides we're going to have to start taxing Americans, something that they had never done before. They figured out how much it was going to cost to keep the troops. That the army can give them estimates of how many soldiers are going to be there and how much it costs to feed them and clothe them and all that other stuff. So they know how much it's going to cost. So they did some numbers. They cracked some numbers and they said, okay, we'll continue to pay half of that out of the Royal Treasury, but we expect the American assemblies, the Americans, to pay half of the cost of keeping the army in North America. In 1764, Parliament passed a law that is known as the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act, 1764, first time Parliament had ever taxed Americans. So we have to stop now, and this is the end of the hour. This is the end of the first segment of this week. We'll pick it up with the Sugar Act for the next class.